Hi, and welcome to our lesson on facilitation techniques. My name is Clark Imus, and I'll be facilitating this online lecture. Let's go ahead and get things underway. When we think about teaching, we've said this several times before, that it is both an art and a science. There is some science behind teaching. It includes things like the learning styles we've discussed, the learning theories, and pedagogy. Facilitation itself within education is defined as something very simple: to make it easier, right? It's a method of interacting with students that enhances their learning. You'll need to know and understand your audience to be able to truly be a better facilitator, because the way in which you interact with your students will be in a different fashion. Rather than being the sage on the stage, you're going to be the facilitator on the floor. You're going to be moving around and discussing, utilizing active learning strategies, recognizing the preferred methods for learning, and helping them progress from that lower order to higher order critical thinking. In other terms, we oftentimes will use for facilitated learning include experiential learning. Experiential learning is learning through experience, the ability for you to be able to be thrust into an experience and to learn from it, whether it be a simulation or even a clinical experience or even a task for the first time. Learning by doing the experience itself is experiential learning. Constructivist learning is a learning process based on construction, step by step, piece by piece, by building to get there. And our last would be examples of innovational learning, learning that is going to be new and creative, ways in which we can do as much as we can to help facilitate that learning experience. Now, adults as learners, again, are generally motivated and independent. Most of our adult learning styles are going to be drastically different than that from children, and most of us as adults have experienced excellence in education. We have an experience of what good and bad education is, both positive and negative experience within our own education, and then the things that we've observed through others as well. Now, adult learners need to see that professional development and their day-to-day activities are related and relevant. So again, to help facilitate that, you're going to have a buy-in factor to this, meaning that the students are going to have a want to make learning meaningful. And when we can tap into that buy-in factor, we can tap into those internal, intrinsic reasons why a student wants to be there, especially that of an adult. We oftentimes can do a number of great things to help facilitate the learning process by tapping into those motivational aspects. Now, learners, specifically adult learners, need direct, concrete experiences in which they apply their learning in the real world. The activities that you try to do in class or that you do in class need to be carefully thought out so that they integrate into the total learning environment. Make sure that you're going to get as much out of it as you can. Again, the more realistic, the more direct and concrete the experiences you can put your students through. We've talked about this before with simulation. The higher the fidelity, the higher the realism, the more impactful the learning and the greater the buy-in factor. Now, when it comes to adults, they love to learn, but adult learning has ego involvement. Professional development must be structured to provide the support from peers and to reduce their fears of judgment by others, because the last thing we want to do when it comes to an adult is deflate their ego so much that they're unwilling to try again, right? We also want to be conscious not to inflate their ego, because there's a clear difference between someone who is confident and someone who is cocky. We also know that adult learners need constant feedback, and feedback really should include performance evaluations and methods in which you can improve performance, focusing where adults should be allowed input into their feedback process, right? So when you're sitting with the student to give them that feedback, number one is it's got to be immediate or as soon as possible for it to be effective. It also has to be focused on improvement and success driven, and that there should be a level in which the student contributes to that feedback, contributes to that process of being prepared for continuous improvement. Now, adult learners need to participate in small groups during the learning experience to move them through the various different domains of learning that exist. So when we think about transferring of learning for adults, it's not automatic, and it's got to be facilitated by the instructor. So transfer of learning is going to be, in essence, is moving through the domains of the learning levels, right? Where you're there to coach and support the facilitation, the techniques, the content that's there to support the learner to progress up through those domains of learning. Again, facilitating is a lot more hands-on. It takes a lot more effort and energy to do so than it does to do a teacher-centered approach with using the PowerPoint and being at the center of the classroom. Now, some characteristics of adult, generally speaking. They're generally autonomous and self-directed, right? Adults have been around the bend for a while. They know how to be able to function, right? They generally function best in a student-centered environment. They need to be free to direct themselves, right? Have that autonomy. And if the teacher acts as a facilitator, it allows the students to retain their control, or at least have a stake in their control, and being able to direct their learning, right? To have an input on their success rather than just being a part of the process. And again, it's really important to get students' perspectives about what to cover. Not necessarily the content specifically. You're going to have, of course, objectives and things that you're going to need to cover, things that you pre-planned for. But maybe the way in which you go about facilitating the learning, that's what you want to be able to get the students' feedback on, is they're going to be able to tell you what works best to help facilitate their learning based from their needs. We also know that adults have a foundation of life experience, right? This oftentimes may enhance or even detract from their learning. We want to try to engage our students by, in essence, drawing on their experiences and being able to connect those dots, relate theories and concepts to things that have happened in the real world, right? It is your job to be able to connect the learning that's happening to the knowledge and experience base that's necessary of an EMS provider. That's not necessarily easy to do, but it's critical for the success of the students, the success of the learner, to make sure they understand how and when and where and why we apply certain things in certain circumstances. We know that adults are going to be goal-oriented, right? They typically know why they're there. They generally appreciate everything that's when it's organized and clearly defined. And the instructor should know what each of the students' goals are, right? Because oftentimes by determining what your goals are and the students' goals, and if there's any conflicts, they may actually help you be able to determine if there's any conflicts within your own expectations, right? Making sure that you guys are all on the same page. We also know that adults are relevancy oriented. They want to know the reasons why they're doing something, right? Because the book says so, or because I said so, is not a good answer, right? The learning has to be applicable in order for it to have value. If there's no meaning, there's no value. If there's no value, then there's no retention of that knowledge. That becomes important. Adults are practical, right? The instructor needs to show the students how the content's useful. Students are going to only typically be interested in material that they feel is crucial to learn, and they may not be interested in learning anything else. So you're going to have to try to help them understand what is critical for them to understand and what are areas that they can let off the gas a little bit. You have to make sure that you approach that gingerly, but it can be done where you can, again, recognize that they're practical and help them facilitate the learning process. We know that adults need to be shown respect, right? Respect is not something that's just tossed out, right? Respect is earned, respect is given. It's the importance of being able to value the wealth behind that relationship that the student brings to the classroom, treating your students as if they are colleagues or if they're peers to a certain extent. And the way in which you can actually, by showing that respect, you can create that experience where they're going to bring more to the table, that they're going to share their ideas, thoughts, and opinions. Now, we talked about finding motivational ways, ways to motivate our student, right? We talk about intrinsic, those internal aspects. There's also extrinsic, right? The things that are on the outside aspects as well, too. We know that one of the keys to being able to facilitate is being able to find ways that you can motivate your students. And you can't do them through always things like monetary values or extra credit or I'll let you out of class early. Those are things that aren't always going to bring any great reward. But there are some areas that we can consider for motivation. Here's a couple of those. The first is going to be social relationship, right? To make new friends or to meet the need for association or for friendship. That's what social relationships are about. Again, some folks come because they really like to be social. External expectations, these are going to be where they have to fulfill some type of expectation for someone else. It's generally someone of authority, whether it's work, maybe it's a loved one, right? And then personal enhancement, to be able to achieve higher status at work, provide professional advancement, or to stay abreast of what is current, what is new, what is competitive. We also have to think about social welfare, right? Community service and the ability to serve mankind. For a long time, that's what's really driven EMS. We didn't do this for the money. We did it because we wanted to contribute and give back to our communities. That social welfare aspect is still present, not as prevalent as what it once was, but it's still there. There's the escape or the stimulation that comes from this, right? To relieve things of boredom or provide a break from a routine at home or from work. Some contrast, right? So a little bit of flavor for what's happening in life. Other folks are going to be there for just cognitive interest, right? They want to learn for the sake of learning, seeking knowledge for its own sake because they've got a curious mind that they're trying to satisfy. Now, there are also barriers to motivation, right? Lack of time is a big one. Students will sign up for something and they don't understand the amount of effort and time that goes into doing it. And then they end up becoming extremely frustrated because they don't have the time to commit. When you think about taking a college class like this, it's a 10-credit class. You should expect to be in active work for class 10 hours a week, in addition to doing 2 to 3 times that outside of class. So anywhere between 10 to 20 hours a week should be considered for you to be able to go through to your coursework and then go and be able to retain some of that information, right? If you don't have 20 hours a week to give to a 10-credit class, it's going to be very hard for you to be able to commit to the learning that needs to occur. So again, lack of time is a concern. Lack of money is an issue when it comes to barrier to motivation. We talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs several times before. If their basic needs aren't met, if they're feeling insecure, unsafe because of a lack of financial stability, that's an issue. Lack of food, lack of shelter, lack of any number of components that may be monetary. Confidence. Some students just don't have good confidence, and the way in which we approach our facilitation can either build them up or tear them back down even more. So confidence becomes an issue. And then scheduling. Are you thinking about when you're scheduling your classes? Are you scheduling your classes on all the weekends? You're only doing Saturday classes, and every Saturday you've got your folks sitting inside while it's nice out and they're stuck inside. That may lead to an issue with scheduling, where they're not wanting to be there on the weekends. That leads to some problems with motivation. Maybe it's the only day off that they have a week, so there's not a chance for them to really kind of rejuvenate themselves before they have to go to class. Those are all areas in which you can see clear barriers to student success and motivation. Other areas you may see is red tape, bureaucracy, or policies oftentimes will get in the way. We can't do that. Why? Because our policy doesn't say we can, and oftentimes we get stuck with that red tape. Another big one, especially nowadays, childcare. We do not have access to routine childcare or even affordable childcare for folks who want to go to improve their education. That's a huge portion. And then transportation. Gas is expensive. A reliable vehicle may not be something that every student has. So those are some things that you kind of, again, just want to be very conscious of when it comes to that motivation. Now these barriers are going to exist, but you also want to understand that you can do quite a bit to help mentor or guide or advocate for your students. You're not responsible for everything, but you can definitely be responsible for helping to facilitate eliminating barriers to success, which in essence will help the students grow more. We also want to think about the best ways to motivate adults, and that's really to enhance their reasons, their own reasons for being here. And then again, decrease the barriers. Don't make extra things more challenging for the student. If you can, decrease the barriers where it's possible, and then find out why they're actually here. Is there a reason why that they're here and what they're trying to get out of this? Now, motivation also sets an appropriate stress level, right? If it was so easy, you could just walk right through it, it wouldn't be worth doing. Sometimes in EMS classes, they promote high stress because we want the student to eventually be responsible for human life. But we have to remember that when students are learning, high stress may not be appropriate. right? We want to create a low stress, safe environment where they can make mistakes and progress them up through those more challenging environments. When it comes to adult learning, there's some things we have to recognize as well too as a facilitator. The first is going to be reinforcement. Reinforcement should be part of your normal process for teaching, right? You want to try to be as positive as you can, making sure that you are going to put your students through situations that are appropriately difficult, that are going to push your students to get out of their comfort zones, to challenge them, and then providing feedback. I mean, those are all going to be really important ways that we're going to be able to do that, right? Challenge, one of the things we think of with that is it might be slightly a different level of difficulty that you have to throw out there for each student. Your strongest student's going to maybe take a pretty darn difficult simulation to be able to get challenged. But your students who are underperformers, or that are falling on the lower third of the bell curve for performance indicators, they're probably going to need a little bit different of a scenario, maybe one that's going to help reinforce some of the areas that they're working on. Negative, right? Anything negative reinforcement-wise, right? It's just best to avoid. A lot of times it makes the students feel alienated, it makes the students feel embarrassed, it may make them feel excluded or harassed. Those are things we don't want to be able to do, right? When we can give feedback from an instructor, from peers, or from other students, it's really valuable. And when a student is very interested about a subject area, it's going to increase their want to learn. It's going to increase their responsibility, their self-responsibility to have for learning as well. Now, with retention, it's important as well. Students got to be able to retain the information that you put forward for them to, because otherwise they're not learning, right? And what's the benefit of just being part of a process that you are experiencing but don't learn from? So you got to think that your job really is to help the students not only get the information, but retain the information that's relevant to the coursework. And retention is directly related to initial learning. If information is not learned very well, it's not retained. Retention is only effective based on the practice in which you utilize it. If you want retention to be there, you have to think consciously about how you can increase retention of knowledge as you plan your lessons and look to facilitate your learning. Now, transference is another aspect, is the ability to use information learned in a new setting. There's positive transference, where you use good behaviors you've learned in the course, and negative transference. It does not use behavior to learn, or it uses it incorrectly. The goal is for positive transference, right? Reach students in all three of the domains of learning, the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor. Then you're going to ensure that you have the greatest level of transference. And again, we want to focus on the positive aspects, not the negative. When it comes to facilitation, right, you've got to have some action in the classroom if you're going to be doing facilitation, right? You can't just lecture. Lecturing is the most passive way to provide information. Sometimes it works, again, in the form of an online class. It's maybe the only way that you're going to get additional feedback or facilitation. But if we're dealing with a true EMS class, engage the students throughout all of the learning activities. It does not mean just in lab or in clinical or simulations, but also in your lecture course activities. Make sure that you're doing things to engage them in their different modalities for learning, right? Part of that is how your classroom is set up. If your classroom layout is set up in rows, well, that's going to be set up for a traditional lecture. You're going to get about 10 to 30% of the content you presented to be retained. But if you pick a layout that's best for the desired activities you plan to use, whether it's small group tables or circles or any number of separated work groups or what have you, all those things will again work towards the student's favor in helping them retain that content. Remember, the interaction between students and the instructor, specifically when it's arranged so that it's focused off the instructor and is going to be placed onto the student. So when you're facilitating, you're not at the center of this. The students are. You may be doing things like activities, like worksheets or case studies or other things that they may be creating or developing in small groups. Make sure that you set your class up to be able to do that physically the way it's arranged. That will make it a much different experience for the students. And as you do this more and more, they'll get used to this, and it'll be easier to make the facilitation occur. Now, we also want to create expectations in students that they're going to participate. We have to make sure that students understand that they are codependent, or that we are codependent on them as part of the learning process, right? So be patient in the beginning, provide guidance, provide positive reinforcement. Remember, students are conditioned to be passive learners. They're conditioned to sit, to be quiet, to raise their hand when they have a question, and wait to be called upon. Active learning and facilitation break that model. So if you're going to need, or if you want your students to succeed, you're going to have to change their expectations and get them to be able to participate in that, get away from that passive learning. Again, lecturing does not facilitate facilitation, okay? Let me repeat that. Lecture does not facilitate facilitation. Time-honored technique with focus on the instructor. Lecturing will never lead to active learning. Lecture disseminates a lot of information quickly with only instructor control. If you're going to try to see how much impact you can have on the learner has to be in control. Your role is to facilitate and guide the process of learning from the side, not from the captain's seat. Now, again, other things. Moving beyond simple lectures. Things you can do. By moving beyond, it's going to help build interest with your students. It's going to help maximize their retention and their understanding of the content you're providing. It involves participants. It involves participation. And when you do need to rely on a lecture style or presentation style, it will reinforce what has been provided. I'll give you an example of my med legal. I do a case, a court case, where we break up and we have different people who do different roles. We have an expert. We have the individual EMS provider being sued, the families, the sheriff's officer, anything and everything we need to be able to do. They're all pre-established with a pre-planned case. We go over the med legal aspects for paramedics the week before to come in to be able to jump right into the overview of the content, so that way we can jump into the meat and potatoes as we explore and participate in a mock case trial. Ends up being a really good technique to be able to facilitate learning in an area that would generally be harder or less interesting to students in a traditional presentation style. Now again, being a facilitator adds more interest to the lecture environment, right? Maximizes understandings. It's going to allow for students to be able to get hooked, right? One of the first things that's important is to create a bridge into your lesson, right? We start off with the bridge and then we work into our objectives. We do a pre-test, we present with meaningful activities, and we do a post-test. The more that you can prepare a hook and prepare your activities, the more that the students will be able to get out of that, because again, it's more interesting when they're not doing lecture. It also involves participants when you're doing presentations, right? Spot challenges and asking about concepts, providing activities and spaces throughout the lecture, assigning portions of the material to be presented by students. Some simple ones I can think of are think, pair, share. Put your two people next to each other, give them a question, let them think about it independently, let them pair up together and talk about it, let them share their ideas with the class. That can take less than 2 minutes to be able to do all of that, and in essence to be able to provide a way in which you're engaging the students with active learning, even though you may be deploying a traditional lecture style format. We know that facilitation reinforces your lecture. It reviews the material that's covered through the activity. It provides application to the problem, and it allows for the participants to conduct their own review, whether it's within the groups or each other, or while they even play games. Sometimes when students are having fun, they don't really realize that they're learning, and facilitation can help that. When it comes to group work, it's one of the best ways of ensuring active learning. I love group work. Make sure that you have groups formed, or you can form them quickly. There's some benefits and downsides of the same group versus change groups weekly. And the varying skills levels is going to determine how groups are assembled as well too. I like to use squads and use the squads where the students get used to be able to work together, but I also like to be able to mix things up depending on what class it is as well. When you're assigning group work, there's a number of ways that you can do this. Randomly, where you count them off, you can use letters, you can use colored stickers, whatever it is. But you want to try to allow the students to have some control, but generally this will occur at random. If you're going to be doing the teacher control, this is where the instructor actually uses the strategy ahead of time to be able to determine who should be in what specific groups based on characteristics. Again, we're not just going to throw them all together based on learning styles, but You know, they're stronger students, maybe often there's a pair of weaker students, try to give some balance to the group. And if it's student controlled, oftentimes that's going to solicit more of the social aspect for students. And sometimes it works really well, and sometimes it may not work as well when the students get to pick. You just have to know your group and really understand what the importance of that group work is within your lesson plan, within your assignment. Assigning jobs in the class setting. If you're going to be assigning jobs in the class setting, this is a method of increasing participation to have them do. So you can, having them setting up the room, you could have a master of arms or someone that's there to control the break. I typically use classroom commander for that. There could be a recorder or note takers, mentors, or coaches. Any number of aspects that can help assigning jobs in the classroom setting are a really effective tool to be able to do that. Again, I would encourage you to go out to our EMS student resources, again on our website, and you'll be able to find those classroom commander, classroom squad leader, and squad member roles and job descriptions. Again, it helps facilitate the career aspect within class. Instructor may assign tasks, right? So maybe you're going to go ahead and assign tasks based on alphabetical order, date of hire, birth date, lottery, I mean, you name it, right? It could be any number of things that you use to randomize some of those aspects. When we do certain things in class, make sure that everyone gets a fair shake at it, right? Don't have favoritism towards one student or another. Rotate through all of those. Make sure that you works best with your team members of 4. So when you're doing any types of groups, the more you have, oftentimes it can be almost too many people at once. Smaller groups are better. 4 is probably about best. 4 to 6, 6 will work. Sometimes you get a couple wallflowers when you're doing 6 in group work, but 4 is a really good number to be able to use for that. Now, when you're trying to be able to manage your groups effectively, you got to think about a couple things up front. Number one is you got to have some rules, right? Everybody's got to show up on time. Everybody's got to come with the assignments ready to go, be prepared to class and do the discussion. Anyone that's not there, they've got to figure out who's not there and what's missing before class starts. We got to look about how we're going to share that information, know that we're going to have different views, values, and ideas, and then whatever else are the rules we might need to agree upon. If we're going to talk about something that's a really hot button topic, like, for example, mandated vaccinations for healthcare workers, there are a lot of people that have some really strong beliefs in that area. You got to make sure you got some other ground rules to cover those hot spots that may pop up, so we don't let things get out of hand when it comes to our facilitation. When you're talking about groups, right, have some people there that are going to help you be able to facilitate this. These are generally going to be assigned to students because you don't have that many instructors with you, but we want roles within those groups, right? So someone should be there to help facilitate a discussion. That doesn't mean you as the instructor. Give these to your students to do. Someone that's going to be a recorder. It's going to record down what happened. Someone's going to be able to report out what's happened, and someone that's there to actually help keep time or to be there for accuracy or for coaching, right? Those are going to be things for helping to manage those groups effectively. Give them some roles to be able to do. We also want to make sure that when we're using groups in a large class or in a group that has a lot of new, inexperienced students, you got to make sure that you're really organized. Clearly defined activities, clearly stated objectives, bring the class together as much as you need to. One student has a question about something, stop the thing and broadcast it to everybody, right? Make sure that it's clear, make sure that you have frequent interventions or intervals, pardon me, for being able to provide that feedback. The third thing is plan both groups and individual assignments, because there's always going to be somebody who doesn't want to do the group work, and that or you're going to find someone that there's people that are taking on more of the group work than they should, and they're excluding others. Have a plan for a little bit of both. Also, look for signs of behavior that undermine the group function, right? People on their phone, people just doing it for a social event, right? And then use peer facilitators to help you assist a group. Right? If you assign some clear roles to have a group facilitator, and that group starts to go off, you can easily get them to get that peer group back on track by letting their peer facilitator know what's going on. Now, when you're dealing with conflict within groups, there's a multitude of levels that we have to be able to go through. The first level, level 1, is really the idea of preventing the escalation from occurring in the beginning when it comes to conflicts within a group. First off is monitor for early signs of conflict. Watch for body clues, nonverbal clues, previous history that students may have had with one another. Those are things to pay attention to. And if you see that it is beginning to build, immediately intervene and put it out. That's the best thing you can do. Don't let it escalate to a problem if you can squash it early. Use group evaluations to help control individual students' behavior. If you're having individual students that are causing problems, the herd mentality sometimes will work in keeping them to control when you're using group evaluations versus individual evaluations. And then encourage spontaneous and verbal feedback, right? If it's a situation where we don't want them just bursting out, maybe it's where they can give verbal feedback to their group to be able to discuss things as the learning is occurring in that group activity in real time. Level 2, we want to empower our students. One of the things that's important is to listen to our students' concerns as they talk about aspects that are going on, things that they're not sure about, things that they don't feel that are right or accurate. Listen to them, right? The next step is to encourage the students to resolve the conflict on their own, right? So what can we do to facilitate their ability to resolve the conflict? Are there questions that you can ask that will help facilitate the group discussion? I'm a big believer in Socratic questioning, asking a lot of really open-ended questions about why were you thinking that, or why were you feeling that way, or how did that make you feel, or what was going through your head in that exact moment. Those style of questions encourage the students to think and in essence work to resolve conflict on their own. And where you can't be able to do that, you want to coach students to follow specific or to utilize resolution strategies where they're appropriate, right? If it's getting to the point where things are getting a little bit out of control, we want to know that we can use our students to be able to dial that back in if we empower them properly. But then at some point, we also have to recognize that, like, okay, look, there's some actual conflict that has to be resolved. And that's where we're going to get in there and get involved. Typically, we're going to have pre-established ground rules ahead of time. We may ask for each student to present a point of view that they have. We may ask each student to define what they feel is the ideal outcome for a said discussion, and then review the ground rules. And you are going to have to do your due diligence to really facilitate a discussion of any possible outcomes that you're going to be dealing with. And our final aspect of this is the instructor intervention. And this is going to be where when things get way out of control and things are just starting to burn up on you, pull out your rule book, syllabi, student manuals, handbooks, right? Other members of the teaching team. If things ever escalate to the point where you're doing group work and it gets to be where people are just not following the basic safety rules or the respect and guidelines of the learning environment, now you've got clear violations. We've got that coaching and counseling aspect we talked. We've got all these great things we can use. Now we need to refer back to those materials to make sure that the student is informed of what is appropriate when it comes to responding to a group. Now again, facilitating discussions is one of the best ways that you can have participatory learning, right? It's great for recertifying refresher classes. Topics involving a lot of opinions are really good for this. And it's a great way to get started or even wrap up a class. The more you can get your students to be involved, the better off that you're going to be at retaining that information for them. If you motivate them by giving them a task like this, you're going to stay in their brain. You're going to get that content retained in your head. Now, there's some tips that you can use when you're facilitating as well, right? Get all the students involved. Redirect any inattentive students. If they're there and they're just not focusing, bring them back in, right? Ask them a question. Ask them to move their spot, right? There is no need to comment on everything that's being contributed. I find sometimes I struggle with that, where I want to go through and I want to just rehash everything they said and go why it was so great and why it was needed to be improved. And next thing I know, I've taken away all the discussion points for the entire group. Where I need to would be at the end, typically, is to paraphrase what was said and to kind of glaze back over those highlights and reinforce those core areas. Now, other tips. Compliment good comment, good comment, or redirect inaccurate or incorrect statements. So if things are going like they're supposed to, or they're not, or they're incorrect, it doesn't matter. Identify it, right? That's close, but not quite. Here's where it's at, and give them an example of how to be able to do that, right? Be positive about it, leave room for improvement, and then provide what's the most appropriate or correct attribute. We may need to elaborate. We may need to energize on something. We may even need to play the role of being one that goes against the grain, one that disagrees. We want to do what we can to mediate differences in opinions, and then putting everything together at the end is really important. Take all those great ideas and put them together and summarize what has occurred in the discussion group. Now, I'll tell you, these exact same concepts can be used not only in a class for a face-to-face discussion, but it's also a really great way in which you can use for an online discussion as well. Now, when you're doing the psychomotor sessions, again, it's going to help make those sessions more interactive. We're going to get transference as we continuously repeat the different practices we're using. And again, these examples could be things like role-playing, games, simulations, or even problem-solving tasks. We want to see where we're able to explain the objective, explain the benefits, and then divide those students into groups. From there, we're going to speak slowly when we're giving our directions, briefly giving our overview, followed by specific information. And if we're giving anything that's new equipment, we're giving directions before we start passing out equipment. You may hear this is what's called the whole part whole, where you're going to go over the whole thing, and then you're going to go over all the pieces in the part separately, and then you're going to go with detail, and then you're going to go back over and demonstrate it one more time as it goes through. And at that point, you can let your students break loose and begin to do the skill practice. You want to make sure things keep moving, keep challenging your students, recap and critique at the end of each session, whether if it's just a skill or if it's a scenario. Keep things moving, keep things engaged as you go through. The more engaged your students are, the more active they are in the learning experience, the more where they're going to, again, retain. When we think about facilitating activities, it takes some time. Usually lectures faster. However, as you get more and more comfortable with this, you're finding your students are going to get faster at being able to do these in-class activities. They're not usually going to argue with their own findings, especially if they find this is a way in which they can learn while practicing. So some things to help you avoid any type of time interruptions. Start on time. Give clear instructions one time. I like to also hand it out on paper. Prepare visual information ahead of time. Distribute your handouts as quickly as you can. Expedite your group reporting. And record on flip charts so you don't have to have any additional repeat information. I like to use sticky notes where I'll put a bunch of sticky notes with topics on the board, and I can use an activity or a game or something to have them run up and grab the things that they want. I've done it where it's just randomly assigned. There's a number of different things that you can do. But you want to make sure you're not repeating the information, that's for sure. You're going to have to be able to have their students shorten down their discussion points. You specifically also will. You're also going to get volunteers faster than you have in the past. You got to think about how you create energy to quicken the pace of your students, right? Maybe music is one of those ways. When they come in, you have some music going, some beat. You can kind of get their blood flowing a little bit, right? And then come back from group work or breaks as promptly as you can. Stick to your times. No one likes having things just go with the wind. If you have a schedule, stick to your schedule as best as you can. That's where lesson planning is really critical as an instructor, because you're going to plan for lots of stuff, and you may have to really be flexible with how you do that, because you can't fit everything into every lesson. So keep that in mind as you're doing these practical sessions. Now, classroom control is another aspect we have to think about. Some students think that your job is to sit and talk at them, and that their job is to sit and pretend to listen to you. And when they don't learn, they'll get frustrated. But they think that you're not doing your job, and that's not the case. The students are more responsible for their own learning than anyone. And the best person to get their most out of the learning is themselves. And we have to be able to do the best we can to maintain that control. So you have to explain to them why you're doing what you're doing. That's one of the things that I found that's very helpful. When you explain why you're doing what you're doing, it's a lot easier for students to be able to have that buy-in factor. You also have to make sure you're really facilitating to stay on task. That means sometimes you're going to have to speed things up or slow things down on the fly. Keep that kind of in mind. Students also have to having difficulty may give up and quit working before asking for assistance. That's where your role as a facilitator is to float around and see what you can do to remotivate that student, to get that student back on track. Offer assistance in finding resources, but don't do the work for them, right? Oh, I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it. There's what's called the 3 before me technique, and that is you have to find 3 answers before you come to me. You have to try 3 ways of solving. Now, there's also some tips for calling participants to order. Regardless of what technique you're going to use, start on time, right? If you're not early or late when it comes to being a teacher, typically you should be there an hour before your class starts to be prepared. Things that you can use. Kitchen timers. There are a ton of different timer apps that are out there now. There are computer-based, internet-based timers, right? You can flick the light switch. You can make certain statements. You can have everybody do a verbal wave, and everybody sees what it is, a unique buzzer or sound. It doesn't matter what it is. But when you need to start an order, make sure you do that. One of the things that I thought was pretty goofy when I was doing some teacher education was that anytime we would get done with group work from this lesson, this gal had this little xylophone thing, and she would ding this certain chime, and everybody would immediately come back, and I was like, boy, that seems awful childish to have to play like a tune on this instrument. The second day, we had talked about it that night. Her and I was curious about why she was doing that, and so she said she would do it the next day, and it was unbelievable. It took 5 minutes more than it ever did to get everybody back together because she didn't play that sound. And it's something you have to do with helping the brain be able to do that transition, I assume. But it was a unique way to be able to do that. So things to kind of keep in mind. Now, we also know group work is not purely freedom, right? When you put people in group work, it's not just a free-for-all. It's not a situation where we're going to basically just let one person monopolize the discussion or argue or just along those lines. We want to make sure everybody can participate, and each new comment must build on some type of previous idea. It's got to have some type of positive attributes to maintain that order. We want to connect on a personal level. We want to make sure that we change methods that you're using, that we ignore small nuances, discuss the negative behaviors that happen in private, praise in public, and if when in doubt, or we're not sure how to maintain order, seek advice from others. Again, when you think about your role as an educator, it's less about being the sage on the stage. It's less about being the teacher-centered approach. It's about being the facilitator of learning, recognizing that all learners are going to start and end in a different spot. And it's our job to do what we can to facilitate them to where they need to be, to do as much as we can to engage them and to make sure that their learning environment is active so that we get the most retention and the most meaning out of our time together in the classroom. And so I hope that this lesson was meaningful to you, and hopefully these facilitation tools will help you contribute into your student teaching and into your careers beyond. Thanks, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.